Well, good morning, everybody. A lot of folks here across the United States still dealing with some natural fireworks from yesterday. You're watching a live lightning map pretty early in the morning here on Wednesday morning. And some of the storms that are going through parts of Kansas yesterday did a lot of damage in parts of Nebraska and Kansas with severe weather. Well, we're also watching some active storms continuing here in the upper Midwest, like in the UP, and some isolated storms around the rest of the country. But take a look at this map. This one shows you the last 24 hours of lightning strikes. And I believe that the lightning strikes that are recorded on blitzertongue.org are the cloud-to-ground strikes only. And across North America, including, of course, the Caribbean and Central America, and this section here of South America, we had nearly 500,000 cloud-to-ground lightning strikes, and that's getting added to this morning. A lot of that weather that came through was severe, though, and a few isolated reports of strong wind damage throughout parts of the eastern United States. But getting back into the central U.S., coming out of Colorado into Nebraska and Kansas, numerous reports of strong straight-line wind damage and also some very large hail. Saw some reports of baseball-sized hail yesterday. So to show you what these storms look like, this is just as the sun was rising this morning. So this is what's left of those storms. But if I take you back to last night, again, we can just see those storms just exploding here on the heat of the day and the instability that's been in this section of the country just along this leading edge of a front that's coming through this area. We'll talk about more in a moment. But before I do that, take a look at the smoke that's coming out of parts of British Columbia into Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. This was smoke yesterday afternoon on the 4th of July. And we're continuing to watch wildfires here in parts of British Columbia, northern Alberta, and then also here in Ontario and Quebec. But if you notice the flow of the smoke, okay, this is going to be actually important for us to understand this current setup of the atmosphere. Like I always say, it's tracing out the flow. And there's a front that is dipping through the midsection of the United States. That's going to change up the precipitation pattern for some places that really need it. But notice over the next 2 days, we're expecting the air quality to be lower here in parts of the Pacific Northwest, not because of local fires, but because of those that are to our north here in parts of British Columbia and Alberta. Okay, so surface winds. I know the map doesn't show a lot of contrast, but I just want to point out that right in through here by later in the day today, there's a frontal boundary, and you can see the flow coming out in this direction. It is what's prompted some overnight lows last night and again tomorrow morning that have been in the 40s in parts of like Montana and the Dakotas, and that cooler air is going to continue to push itself to the east. But anytime we can get a front to move through the country, that's going to increase our chances of starting to get some better, lift in the atmosphere for precipitation. So how cold is the front? Well, behind it we have temperatures right now early this morning when compared to a day ago that are 10 to almost 20 degrees cooler than they were. So this is a potent front for this time of year. We often don't see very strong cold fronts this time of year, but take a look at what this one's going to do to our temperatures. So today's max temperatures here on Wednesday, we got temperatures that'll struggle to get towards 70 degrees here in the central United States. But we continue to watch what we talked about earlier this week, ridges flanking the coasts of the United States. And those ridges are going to be important to understand what this kind of the duration of this colder air that's coming through the midsection of the country, how long it's going to be around. The second piece to this flow we're going to watch is where does the ridge rebuild itself down here in the southwest? Is it more closely oriented to Texas, or is it more New Mexico and Arizona? That will be critical to understanding going into week 2 where those ridge riding storms are going to be. But let's just get to the temperature forecast now. This is going into Thursday and Friday. So a lot of cooler air for this point in July coming right here into the midsection of the country with temperatures not really getting out of the 70s. A lot of times in July, we're worried about overnight lows that can get this high in the midsection of the country. And here we are looking at high temperatures that are, again, likely going to be below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Here we are on Saturday, same setup. Look at the heat building back into Texas, over to New Mexico and Arizona. Still quite a bit of heat throughout the Intermountain West. We'll watch daily convective events pop up here. Those are those pop-up storms that hit the mountains pretty hard, and all the way up here into parts of the Pacific Northwest. And just take note here, the heat that is in the Pacific Northwest now, remember there's a lot of area up here that has been very dry as of late. It's missing out on a lot of those June thunderstorms that can often happen here. But California's Central Valley, to see temperatures somewhere in the 90s, that's technically cooler than average for this time of year. So this is Sunday going into Monday and Tuesday. So overall, we note that there's quite a bit of cooler air compared to normal this time of year in the midsection of the United States. And I want to look at the upper level flow before we dig into what the longer range temperature outlook is going to be. because throughout much of this week, all the way till Monday, this is a feature that I think is really dominating the pattern. So there is a large ridge that's kind of sitting here just off of the Canadian Maritime over Greenland, somewhere to the west of Iceland. And that large ridge has really set things up to be extremely stormy here coming into Europe. In fact, there's a big system curling into like the Scandinavia today, but it's also keeping keeping a deeper trough that's over this part of eastern Canada or central Canada getting into the eastern United States. So what's really happening here is that the North Atlantic is once again kind of where the flow is getting bunched up, if you will. And it's really just preventing the upstream effect to kick all of this out and to get the pattern to start to move. So what it's doing in the near term is producing these larger ridges that are here, and it's kind of bunching up the flow. And as I go out there even farther and farther into the future, we're out here all the way to July the 14th, that ridge is still present there. And we also see the flow building a ridge into the Aleutian Islands. So what we end up getting out of this is something that looks more like that. Now, normally, we have to watch out for this ridge to get too close to the United States. That would be the strengthening of the Bermuda High, but no chance. It's still way here, displaced pretty far to the north and farther away from the U.S. coastline. So you notice out there around July the 14th, this particular ridge reestablishing itself. So what this is going to be important for is to see how do the storms cascade off the top of that ridge coming into the central and eastern United States. What does this do for convection down here along the Gulf Coast, which is how we kind of really rely on midsummer precipitation? And how does this trough that is just sitting here going to impact the Pacific Northwest? And does heat come back into California? Those are all big questions going forward. So let's take a look at the temperature side of this first. I love these animations. It's a 5-day sliding window of average temperature anomalies. So we're just looking here to see who's hotter than normal and who's cooler. So what we're doing is we're sliding out here. I'm going to pause day 5 through 10. So remember, at this time, large ridge setting up here. There is a ridge still pushing into Canada, and we see the ridge opening up there. So a lot of cooler weather, in this section of the country getting into this part of, Manitoba into Ontario. But notice where the heat is in this pattern. Now, this is critical for thunderstorm activity throughout the Four Corner States and Intermountain West. It's also going to be critical for this way the storms are going to cascade over the top of this, those ridge-running storms that we often get in the middle of summer. So from day 5 through 10, let's just extend this out to day 10 through 15. You notice that this whole region, for much of the next 15 days, is not going to be seeing much in terms of long-duration episodes of heat. That's primarily going to be kept along the Gulf Coast, getting into Texas, Four Corner States, Southwest. Now, normally when we start to see heat building here in July in the Southwest, we start talking about maybe an active monsoon setting up, but I don't see that this particular year. I don't see it drawing in deep reservoirs of moisture like this as this heat builds. What we will likely see is storms kind of running around the periphery, maybe hitting some of those very dry pockets of Oregon and Washington, or coming over into Montana and then racing across the rest of the country, kind of where I just drew those lines. That seems to be the way this pattern's setting up. Now, thinking about precipitation, let me take you north of the 49th, and let's go take a look at some stuff from Canada. So this is a precipitation departure from normal map, and it's in millimeters, but we'll just use it to kind of assess the wet locations versus the dry. But you can see the color bar over here on the left. Now, a lot of thunderstorm activity in through this corridor over the last 30 days. And I'm sure some of you, if you're kind of watching this with me on like Twitter or whatnot, you've seen some incredibly photogenic tornadoes that have been in parts of Alberta. But if you come down here, take a look at a big section of southern Alberta, getting into most of the ag region here in Saskatchewan and into Manitoba. There are several locations here that are seeing substantial deficits from normal in terms of precipitation. And this kind of bleeds over here into the northern United States. There are pockets of North Dakota and Montana getting into the upper Midwest. So that would be, of course, including Minnesota and parts of Wisconsin that have been very, very dry. And there's a corridor that when you look back over the last 30 days, right in through here, we have to continue to keep a very close eye on. They've missed out on a lot of this recent precipitation. But that's also to say there's drier conditions here, drier conditions farther to the south. And look, we have not had an early and active start to our southwest monsoon. Quite dry in parts of Arizona and New Mexico. Now we've covered, where the heaviest rains and the flooding has been as of late, and there's been a major recovery in precipitation here across the East Coast. But I kept mentioning what was going on in parts of Oregon and Washington. And I know a lot of us maybe over here don't realize this, but this is some of the most agriculturally productive land, like the Willamette Valley, the Columbia Basin, the Palouse, this area edging up towards Spokane, getting over toward like Coeur d'Alene. There's some incredibly productive ground in through this area that has missed out on a lot of June thunderstorm activity, which typically hits that region. So we need to keep thinking about it. Let me come in a little closer in terms of time. I'm going to show you 2 other time steps here. This would be what the last 7 days has looked like. So now we've got in this map the derecho event that came through right in through here, the storms that followed this, the severe weather that hit this part of kind of the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio River. But you put it all together, and again, on this map, I'm not showing you anything less than a ½ inch. Okay, so it's only a ½ inch and greater. We really see where the heaviest rains kind of hit over the last 7 days. But if I stretch it back out again to 14 days, do you see where those corridors are really beginning to show up? Like, look at the strip through Iowa right in through here. Much of Missouri, Kansas, this side of Oklahoma, Arkansas, down here into the Mid-South, and then there's a lot of parts of Texas, the Red River of the South, getting into Louisiana, Mississippi, that have been very dry. Drought correction here, but it's been getting worse in these key areas. There's also drier spots, like I said, in parts of North Dakota and here. A lack of thunderstorm activity throughout much of the Intermountain West. This is going to kind of change in the coming days, but the lack of thunderstorm activity here really starting to show up. And I just want to point out one more time, look at this region of the Northwest. Take a look at the Snake River Valley. Very dry compared to normal for this time of year. Okay, we've got a good idea about where we've been. We've talked about temperatures. What about this upcoming week? Well, that front that's coming through the upper Midwest and northern plains today is going to stall out somewhere in this vicinity. And if the ridge starts to build back in this area, we're going to get better flow over the top of this. And what I mean by that is there's short waves in the atmosphere that come over this, and they start to initiate the chances for storms. So notice, one of those areas that's been so dry has better chances over the next 7 days of finally picking up moisture here. We're going to continue to stay stormy in the Northeast. A lot of storm activity down here along the Gulf Coast, all the way up to the Carolinas and even the Mid-Atlantic. But that area we've been worried about for drought is starting to show back up here, including the Canadian Prairie, pockets of North Dakota, getting into Minnesota, sections of Wisconsin. They just continue to see, moisture being missed in this particular region. So let's go have a look at what the operational European model is up to here. So this morning, as the front slides through, it's right in through here, we're going to watch for storms to be initiated on this boundary. In fact, let's go have a look here real quick. I should have pulled this up for you before I started, but I do want to show you where we are expecting the strong to severe storms today. Can you see this region? This is right where we're expecting to see the frontal boundary kind of stretch today. And then tomorrow, as that front just kind of continues to dive, it's going to be pushed itself back up against the mountains here and the high plains. And then you see the same thing as we get into the 7th, right into that area. So let's come back to it again. And you see the front coming down today on Wednesday. That's by Wednesday night. Okay, there's that corridor we're going to keep an eye on. And we go from Wednesday night into Thursday. The front continues to dive, the high pressure with cooler air behind it. This is now Thursday morning, getting into Thursday afternoon and evening. So isolated storms to the south. The frontal boundary clears up, but it's just going to stall right in through here. So this is Thursday night, getting into Friday morning, Friday afternoon and evening, getting now into Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon and evening. So you can see a lot of storms in this area, but that front is still sitting in this region. That's Saturday getting into Sunday. This is Sunday evening. And now let's play this out there toward Monday and Monday evening. Now we actually have a reinforcing shot at some cooler air next week coming into this corridor. And that's what's going to bring down this next front by a week from today. So let's keep an eye out on these high pressure cells that are coming out of Canada. They're dry in Canada, but they're pushing storms into this area. So again, the story, ridge here, large ridge there, systems dive out of the central part of North America, just like that. So a couple of maps to summarize this. Total precipitation through the next 7 days. Playing this all the way out there. Let's stop it right here. That's our most active corridor, and that's right where we need some rain. Now, this is not to say we're not expecting an active corridor here too. It's just focusing right here on this really dry region. So over the next 10 days, you end up getting a map like this. This is the European model 10-day forecast for precipitation anomalies, and there's my big concern. That same region continuing to show up with drier conditions. Now, as we look out there at the probability maps, this is the chance of getting an inch over the next 10 days. Let's step it up to 2 inches to see if we can find those really wet corridors, like in through here and here in parts of New England. And then let's also take a look quickly at who's going to be on the drier side of this. So this is the probability of less than half of an inch. But I'm going to be watching the Pacific Northwest and the storms that pop in the mountains carefully, because while the ensembles are not showing, wet conditions here, a couple things to take note of is look at where the jet stream is by, for example, this Sunday. And as we play through next week, you continue to see better flow into this area. That's by Tuesday. As I go out here toward Wednesday and Thursday, some of the models, as the ridge kind of redevelops here, is starting to bring some stronger flow out of the Pacific into parts of the Pacific Northwest. And that could indicate a better setup for more storms. So I'm just saying through the next, let's call it 10 days, we do need to keep an eye on the Pacific Northwest and chances for storms in this region. And you can start to see that showing up in the day 8 through 14 forecast, right? So where the ridge is, that's where the driest and hottest conditions are going to be. Over the periphery of the ridge, that's where the activity is going to be for thunderstorms. Ridge riders, we're looking for that 588 height line. That's what I'll keep an eye on. Now again, I'm just going to remind you of this. The GFS is always too dry here, always too dry. Notice the European, or notice what the CPC is showing. More normal chances for storms down here along the Gulf Coast. Okay, let's get out there and talk a little bit longer range here. The newest CFSV2 forecast released on the 4th of July is suggesting that once we get out past the 20th of July, there seems to be a corridor setting up from Texas through the kind of the western Corn Belt that's drier. See it in through here? There could be some ridge riding storms through it, but it's also echoed in the latest ECMWF extended forecast. Now, the time period you're looking at here isn't just the end of July, but it's July 15th through August 15th. And again, we see the models kind of setting up a drier look into this particular area. Now, we've been talking about this. We know that this area was going to be vulnerable to this if the cold water stays off of off of California, and we keep the Bermuda High displaced way over here. But I'm going to have to question just how dry this is going to be, and here's my primary reason why. Well, for much of that 30-day time period, the model is attempting to put a larger ridge in this area, and that's going to affect the southwest monsoon. But as I've been showing you, you're going to get flow that's going to come over the top of this and likely follow that 588 line right there, and that's going to be an active corridor for storms in this particular setup. So I wouldn't look at this map and say that it's going to be spot on for how dry it's going to be in this area. There's going to be a lot of storm activity there. And one other thing to point out, you'll probably hear a lot of the reports coming out about how warm June was globally. A lot of that's being driven by ocean temperatures. For example, the very warm water here, the developing El Nino in this area, and this in the Atlantic, just this incredibly large area of very warm conditions, which earlier this last month, we talked about how the trade winds, which normally blow in this direction, helping to support the colder currents that come across this part of the ocean, they've been weak, preventing a lot of that upwelling of colder water. That's part of the scenario. So the temperatures here, and also in the Gulf of Mexico, the Western Atlantic, and the Caribbean are very warm. In fact, right now, if you look at the tropical Atlantic, we are warmer in terms of our sea surface temperatures at the beginning of July than we are typically at the peak of hurricane season or in early October, which is when you typically get your warmest ocean temperatures. And what I'm getting concerned about is that the wind shear in the tropics has been near average and even lower than average. With the developing El Nino, there was a lot of concern that we'd be bouncing around up here with our wind shear. And the higher the wind shear is compared to average, which is this black line, the more disruptive it is to tropical systems. But here we are, kind of getting much closer to the tropical season. We're seeing a lot of convective activity coming off of Africa, and the models are suggesting that from now through mid-August, we need to keep an eye on this corridor. especially if the MJO starts to break out and move toward the Western Pacific again. The MJO is not a major factor right now, but if it does, we need to watch this carefully because one tropical system could change everything about a longer range forecast. So I need to be keeping a close eye on that. And I want to show you one last thing here. Let's go over to, not to Europe, but I want to go to Asia, And I want to, actually, let's do it this way. Let's go to Asia. I want to talk about this region. I have been telling you lately that there's been a pretty strong dry signal that's come out of the North China Plain, which is here. We're actually starting to see much wetter conditions showing up in the models in that area. So they grow a lot of crops here, corn, soybeans, that goes toward the Manchurian Plain as well. But the newest forecast data would suggest much above average precipitation there, where I had been worried about drought. So I want to give you that quick international look. And with that, I'll wrap it up. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll talk again tomorrow morning. Thanks.